A gavel crashes down, and the air in the courtroom seems to change. The atmosphere is tense, almost electric as the fine is announced. $200,000. Not a symbolic gesture, not a procedural slap on the wrist. A sum that carries weight. A sum that's meant to send a signal. It doesn't just land on the ledger, it lands like a thunderclap, intended to echo far beyond the four walls of that courtroom. This is not just about punishment. This is about setting an example, making a statement that no one, no matter their platform, no matter their influence, is above the prescribed order. A figure of that magnitude doesn't accidentally slip out of someone's mouth. It's chosen, it's intentional, it's loud without raising its voice. There's a sort of choreography in how it unfolds. The tone of the court shifts from its usual performative legal theater to something sharper. The attorneys freeze in place, eyes darting around. Even the gallery, often just a cluster of bored onlookers and reporters, collectively straightens. This isn't routine. This is personal, and everyone can feel it. The dollar amount becomes more than just a fine. It becomes a symbol, a badge of confrontation between two forces, the old guard wielding institutional muscle and the rising class of unapologetic voices refusing to bow. That figure becomes a weapon, a challenge, a red line drawn not in sand but in concrete. One side of that line holds tradition, authority, and the carefully balanced language of decorum. On the other stands resistance, defiance, and the courage to speak bluntly in places built to silence. As the number rolls through the room, it sparks something visceral. It's not just a number on a sheet. It's a headline waiting to happen. A talking point crafted to ripple across social media, to be debated in echo chambers and dissected on podcasts. It will be labeled excessive by some, righteous by others, but no one will say it was meaningless. This is not the kind of fine meant to recover damages. This is the kind of fine meant to bend the spine, meant to serve as a scarlet letter, a warning to anyone who might consider following suit. It is both a punishment and a prophecy, whispering, "Step out of line, and this is what awaits." And still, what lingers more than the fine itself is the intent behind it. The tone, the calculated precision with which it was delivered. No raised voice, no visible anger, just cold, bureaucratic force, the type that doesn't need to shout because it knows the weight it carries. This is the weight of a system flexing, making sure it's still seen, still feared. It's the system saying, "We are watching." Not just this case, not just this person, everyone. It's the kind of moment that divides a timeline. There is everything that came before this fine, and then there is what comes after. The fine becomes a flashpoint, a moment to measure public reaction, to see who blinks first, the one who imposed it or the one forced to carry it. In some corners, there's a quiet satisfaction, a sense that order has been restored, that lines have been reinforced. But elsewhere, in communities that have long lived under the pressure of unequal scrutiny and tilted scales, it sounds like something else entirely. A declaration of intent, to intimidate, to silence, to make an example out of one for the sake of many. The fine, in its sheer size and symbolic aggression, becomes something impossible to ignore. It's not about restitution. It's not about correction. It's about control. It's about laying down a gauntlet. And now the world watches to see what will be done with it. In the face of a staggering penalty, most would crumble, retreat, or lash out. But not her. She stood there, composed yet fierce, absorbing the shockwave of the judgment without flinching. Where many might have responded with anger or defiance, she responded with something far more disarming: dignity. The kind of dignity forged not in comfort, but in conflict. Her stance wasn't just a refusal to back down. It was a declaration that she would not allow herself to be diminished. There was no dramatic outburst, no shouting, no tears, just the calm, unwavering strength of someone who knows exactly who she is and what she represents. The fine had been meant to humiliate, to undercut her credibility, to force her into silence. Instead, it became the catalyst, for a moment of pure clarity, where she laid bare not just her defense but her truth. She didn't dodge responsibility. She didn't resort to victimhood. She rose above the fray with words that cut sharper than any rebuke. Her voice was measured but filled with emotion. The kind of emotion that doesn't come from a script, but from lived experience. Every syllable was earned. Every pause deliberate. She wasn't there to beg. She wasn't there to apologize for existing too loudly or pushing too hard. She was there to stand tall in the storm, to make sure everyone saw that this wasn't the breaking of a person, it was the revealing of one. What followed wasn't a counterattack. It wasn't a display of power. It was something much harder to dismiss: sincerity. That's what made it so uncomfortable for some, and so moving for others. There's a certain power in speaking plainly, without spin, without performance. A power that can't be faked and can't be ignored. Her response didn't come from a place of calculated politics. It came from the marrow, from the weight of having to carry too much for too long and still show up with grace. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who's been told they're too much, too outspoken, too bold, every person who's been penalized for coloring outside the lines drawn by people who've never had to fight to be heard. Her words echoed with the experience of navigating rooms not built for her voice, systems not designed for her presence. And yet, there she stood, not shrinking, not softening, not performing respectability, just speaking the truth in a room that rarely makes space for it. There was a shift in the room as she spoke, not immediate, but undeniable. The kind of shift that happens when authenticity slices through formality. People listened, not because they were forced to, but because they couldn't help it. Her composure, her cadence, the raw conviction behind every word, it all made for something unforgettable. There's a reason people remember speeches decades later. It's not just the content, it's the moment when someone refuses to be reduced. She didn't just defend herself, she elevated the conversation. She transformed what could have been, a moment of shame into one of strength. The fine tried to define her, tried to wrap her in the narrative of misconduct or disorder. But she tore that narrative apart, not with fury, but with facts, history, and heart. And in doing so, she offered a masterclass in courage. This wasn't about optics. It wasn't about playing to cameras or social media. This was deeper, an act of reclaiming space, of refusing to let someone else's punishment dictate her legacy. Her response transcended the fine. It turned a moment of supposed defeat into one of undeniable triumph. The courage to respond that way, with clarity, restraint, and unshakable truth, is rare. And that's what made it so powerful. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't let the system box her in. She rose instead to her own standards, to her own values, to a level that demanded attention not through force, but through integrity. The room was supposed to be a space of order, a temple of process and precedent, where emotion was trimmed away in favor of procedure. But as she began to speak, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a stillness that crept in from the corners, a quiet that didn't feel empty but full. The usual rhythm of courtroom dialogue, stiff and rehearsed, dissolved into something more human. She wasn't there to merely offer a rebuttal. She was about to tell the truth, the kind that doesn't require a law degree to understand. Her voice cut through the formalism, not loud but undeniable. She began to lay out not just her perspective, but the weight of everything that had led to that very moment. Every sentence carried history. Every phrase bore the fingerprints of someone who had been through more than a single courtroom could possibly judge. This wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration. A mapping of pain, resilience, and pride etched into her words like stone. What followed didn't feel like testimony. It felt like a confession, not of guilt, but of reality, of how rules are often applied unevenly, of how the expectations change depending on who is speaking, of how systems that claim neutrality often tilt away from the ones trying hardest to be heard. She didn't need to yell it. She didn't need dramatic gestures. It was the stillness in her presence that spoke the loudest. The stillness of someone carrying years of unspoken stories and deciding, in that moment, to finally let one out. Every person in that courtroom, from the legal staff to the public observers, could feel it. The shift from legal discussion to human confrontation. One that asked not for permission but for attention. Her truth wasn't wrapped in legal jargon. It wasn't carefully curated for public relations. It was raw, and in that rawness came its power.
She was doing something that doesn't often happen in those spaces. She was making people feel. There's a unique discomfort that happens when someone speaks too much truth in a room built to contain it. It becomes hard to maintain distance.
People look up from their notes, eyebrows furrow, arms uncross. Something about the atmosphere changes, because it's no longer just about law, it's about justice. And those are not always the same thing. As she continued, there was no anger in her tone, though no one would have blamed her if there had been. Instead, there was something deeper, the sound of someone trying to bridge the impossible gap between being heard and being understood. She wasn't just speaking for herself. You could hear it in the way she talked about legacy, about the weight of walking into rooms where you're seen first as a disruption before being seen as a person. She was opening a window into what it means to fight for dignity where it isn't freely given. And still, despite all that pressure, she never crumbled. She never lost the thread. Her voice never wavered. There was too much at stake. Not just the fine, not just her reputation, but the bigger question of whether someone like her was allowed to speak hard truths in spaces that claimed to honor them. It wasn't just a personal reckoning. It was a collective one. A mirror held up to those in power, asking them whether they truly understood the consequences of wielding it. She didn't demand pity or special treatment. She demanded recognition, not as a symbol, but as a full, complex human being, doing her best in a system that often rewards silence over substance. What she did in that room was more than bold. It was transformative. She turned a disciplinary moment into a dialogue. She turned accusation into revelation, and in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that the most powerful thing a person can do in a space built to silence them is to simply, honestly speak. What began as a tense procedural moment swiftly evolved into something far greater than anyone in the room expected. It had all the markings of confrontation, authority being exercised, consequences being imposed, a line being drawn. But what followed defied the usual rhythm of power and response. Instead of a combative standoff, the moment unfolded into a profound exchange, one that transcended politics, procedure, and posturing. It became deeply human. She didn't enter that room to play a part. She wasn't there to perform respectability or bend her identity to fit the mold expected of her. And yet, when the stakes escalated, when the judgment fell like a hammer, she didn't meet it with fire or fury. She met it with something more unsettling: vulnerability, not weakness, not surrender. Vulnerability, in the way only someone who truly knows the depth of their strength can show it. The kind of vulnerability that forces people to see past their preconceptions and actually listen. Her words were deliberate, not because she was choosing them carefully to please the audience, but because she understood their weight. Every sentence she spoke had the cadence of someone who's lived through more than the headlines will ever capture. She didn't speak for applause or sympathy. She spoke because silence would have been a betrayal of everything she stood for. In doing so, she pierced through the noise of partisanship, media spin, and legalese. The room, so often a stage for rigid protocol and hierarchy, became something else entirely. It became intimate. It became personal. People stopped hearing a politician. They heard a person. They saw someone who could have chosen to protect herself, to retreat into pre-written statements and defensiveness. Instead, she chose truth. She chose to tell her story in a way that wasn't just about her, but about the many who've had to fight for their seat at the table, who've had to endure disproportionate scrutiny just to be allowed to speak. That courage, quiet, grounded, undeniable, struck a chord. It interrupted the rhythm of power and pride. It dissolved the armor that so often surrounds people in positions of judgment. Because it's one thing to face opposition. It's another to face honesty, honest emotion, honest struggle, honest conviction. These things disarm in a way that arguments can't. They make people uncomfortable not because they're aggressive, but because they're real. As she continued, the lines that usually separate people in those rooms, lines of ideology, status, and allegiance, began to blur. What she was saying wasn't red or blue. It wasn't progressive or conservative. It was human. It was the reality of carrying burdens while being expected to stay quiet. It was about integrity in the face of retaliation. It was about resilience, but not the shiny kind they put on posters, the kind that shows up tired, bruised, and still standing. In that moment, even those who came in ready to dismiss her had to reconsider. Not because she begged for understanding, but because she spoke with the kind of clarity that makes understanding impossible to avoid. People didn't just hear her, they felt her. And once that happens, the debate shifts. It stops being about right or wrong on paper and starts being about right or wrong in principle. The most surprising thing about the entire exchange was not that she spoke so powerfully, but that the atmosphere around her allowed it to land. That for once, words weren't deflected, they were received. There was no performance, there was no strategy, just a rare, raw moment of mutual recognition. One where even those who thought they were there only to enforce the rules were reminded of something deeper. That justice, at its best, is not about control. It's about connection. What unfolded wasn't just one person defending themselves against a fine or a reprimand. It was a meeting point between power and truth, between structure and soul, between how things are and how they could be. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, something extraordinary happened. The barrier between authority and humanity broke, if only for a second, and what was left was something real. In the end, what was meant to be a moment of punishment transformed into a moment of power, not the kind that is handed down from a bench, but the kind that rises up from within. She didn't leave the room diminished. She left it defined by her poise, her truth, and her ability to shift the emotional center of the entire space without ever raising her voice. That's not an act of rebellion. It's an act of resilience. Her response turned the fine into a footnote, and the speech into the story, in a place where people are expected to conform, to fold under pressure, to submit quietly when confronted with force. She offered another path, one where grace stands taller than fear, and where truth cuts deeper than authority. And what made it unforgettable was not that she won an argument, but that she changed the energy of the room. She didn't beg to be seen. She demanded to be heard. And she was. This wasn't just about one case or one decision. It was about what happens when someone refuses to let their voice be caged. It was about the power of standing in your truth, even when the system tries to write the ending for you. Because in a world where image is often mistaken for substance and loudness confused for strength, she reminded everyone that quiet conviction can sometimes roar the loudest. There are moments in history where the formalities of a room are overwhelmed by the force of a person's presence. This was one of them. Not because it ended in reversal or vindication, but because it ended in humanity. It ended in the recognition that vulnerability is not weakness, and that grace under fire is its own kind of resistance. The fine might have been the headline, but her response was the legacy. And for everyone watching, whether in the room or from afar, it became something more than a legal issue. It became a lesson in courage, an example of what it looks like when someone speaks not to defend their ego, but to affirm their identity. In doing so, she left an imprint not just on the moment, but on the collective memory of all who witnessed it. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement isn't the one written in law, it's the one spoken from the heart with nothing but truth to carry it.